Hello, my name is Sam Feltham, and welcome to Expert Interviews here on Smash the Fat. With me today is investigative writer Nina Teicholz. How you doing, Nina?
Hello, nice to see you.
Perfect. And I was just double checking. Did I get your last name right?
Yes, you did. Teicholz. Thank
Yes,
you.
spot on, spot on. Because yeah, I've been watching a lot of the interviews that you've been doing on Good Morning America and other such channels and things like that, which is absolutely fantastic. And
Thank you.
I was just talking to you before we started that I just finished the book. In fact, I finished yesterday, so that's kind of lucky. But
I commend you.
thanks. Because yeah, it is. It's quite a large book, and I've sort of mentioned on my Twitter feed that it's a real treatise. It's almost 500 pages.
Although a third of it is footnotes, over
Yeah.
1,300 footnotes, so it's not quite that scary.
No, no, maybe a bit more towards sort of 350, was it?
Right.
Yeah, that's it. But it's a fantastic book, The Big Fat Surprise. So how did you come from sort of to actually write this book? How did that come about?
Well, I'm a journalist, and one of the things I was doing sort of on the side was this little dinky restaurant review column that didn't have a budget to pay for meals. So I just had to eat whatever the chef decided that he or she wanted to send out to me. And I discovered that chefs didn't want to send out stir-fry vegetables and chicken breasts, I had been pretty much a vegetarian for decades, and that was what I would have ordered. But chefs didn't want to send out that. They wanted instead to send out red meat, pate, foie gras, things in cream sauces, a lot of foods that I had rarely, if ever, eaten. And I found that they were delicious and earthy and rich and textured. I somehow miraculously lost like the stubborn 10 pounds I had been fighting, and my doctor said my cholesterol levels were fine. So that was this mystery. How could I be eating contrary to the dietary advice of the past 50 years and yet feel better than ever? So that was the beginning of really nearly a decade-long journey to try to understand, to research all the science behind what we thought we knew about fat and nutrition.
Yeah, and it's quite a bit of a mess, and you chronologically explain very succinctly, really, about how it was around about the 1960s that we started to go awry, and you kind of explain what's really happened over the past 15 years in quite a bit of detail. That some of the stuff that I've never heard of before, so I was thoroughly impressed that there was stuff in there that I wasn't aware of, which is awesome. And yeah. So you sort of explain to us how did we get into this position of demonizing saturated fat, and we have this low-fat diet craze?
It really goes back to the 1950s when in the US and in the UK there was this sudden epidemic of heart disease that had risen sort of almost out of nowhere from the beginning part of the century to being the #1 killer. And researchers and experts were desperate for answers, and there were a number of ideas about what might be causing heart disease. And one scientist named Ansel Keys, he proposed that it was saturated fats causing heart disease. He turns out to just have been this really outsized character, tremendously charismatic, and he was able to insert his idea about saturated fats into the nutritional guidelines of the American Heart Association, which is it's really the most influential group in the United States with respect to heart disease. Their nutritional guidelines are like the gold standard for fighting heart disease. And the very first anti-saturated fat guidelines came out in 1961. But that happened before that idea had ever been scientifically tested. It was just based on very weak scientific evidence. There was just this tremendous drive and need to do something about heart disease. But basically, the experts really jumped the gun and made these recommendations before the science was ready. And it's like the rest is a little bit history from there. I mean, from there,
Hmm.
it gained institutional momentum. That's really the story behind this idea, which is it wasn't just the American Heart Association, but also our National Institutes of Health, our highest scientific body of the land, that adopted this idea, a hypothesis that saturated fats cause heart disease. And that institutional momentum behind the idea just colored all the interpretation of the science for decades to come. And it's really been only recently that scientists have gone back and re-examined that original science, which I also did. All the original studies that had just sort of been taken for granted what the conclusions said. And those scientists going back, and also my own research, the reality is that the studies that were used to prove that saturated fats cause heart disease really never did that. They were not solid science. I mean, just as an example, one study, the LA Veteran Study, one of like the 4 core studies used to prove this hypothesis, they didn't control for smoking. It was done in a veterans hospital, and half the men wandered in and out of the hospital and had half their meals outside of the hospital. They didn't know anything about what those men ate while they were outside the hospital. So, and there was one of the other fundamental studies called the Oslo study, also didn't control for smoking. So there are just these fundamental methodological problems with these studies that make them very weak and poor science. And that's the story of this history that we're just now beginning to unravel and try to make our way back out of.
Yeah, and one thing that's kind of been going on over the past 15 years is that there have been sort of a lot of relatively good randomized controlled trials on low carbohydrate diets versus low fat diets versus Mediterranean diets, and sort of tell us about what's happened over the past 15 years on a day, because today across the UK newspapers, Weight Watchers has sort of been awarded to be the NHS's diet club, essentially. They're going to be state funded in the UK. So it's kind of sad to see that they're still sort of latching on to the low fat diet dogma. But sort of give us a roundup of what's happened in the past 15 years to kind of say, hey, we need to reverse this.
Well, so for many years, there were no studies of basically what's known to most people as the Atkins diet, right? In his time, he came out with his book in the 1970s, international bestseller, and he had only his medical files to point to. There were no good scientific trials of his diet. But starting in about the year 2000, a number of scientists became interested in trying to test his diet, and they did not come up through the regular channels of nutrition science. In other words, they hadn't been schooled in this idea that fat and saturated fat were necessarily bad for you. Actually, they were kinesthesiologists. They were interested in the science of sports. They were athletes. One of them, a man named Jeff Volek, was the state champion of lifting. I forget, but an incredible athlete. So, and they started to do really good randomized controlled clinical trials. That's the best kind of science that you can do. And they looked at a high-fat Atkins-style diet compared to a low-fat diet. And they did dozens of trials on numerous different populations: men, women, people with metabolic syndrome, people with diabetes. And then there were, spreading out from this small group of scientists, now there's been a scientist at Stanford who's done a long trial, and there have been now two-year-long trials. 2 years is like what you need to do to really show that there are no long-term harmful effects. People used to think that the Atkins diet caused renal problems or bone density loss, and all those trials show that a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet performs far better than a low-fat diet does on really every outcome measure you can look at, for obesity, weight loss, for diabetes, and for heart disease. And I'll just tell you about one really interesting study, because we've come to believe, in the United States at least, that the Mediterranean diet is the best diet for for fighting heart disease and stroke.
Yeah.
And that's because in all the clinical trials that are done, it's compared to the low-fat diet. Well, the low-fat diet has really, it's been tested more than any other diet in history. That diet is a failed diet. And the Mediterranean diet looks better than that. But in one really well-conducted clinical trial, and by that I mean they actually fed people in a cafeteria. They didn't just hand them a diet book, because those kinds of trials, you don't really know what people are eating. So in a really well-controlled trial done in Israel, they had 3 arms of the study. They had a low-fat arm, they had a Mediterranean diet arm, and then they had an Atkins arm. Well, as expected, the Mediterranean diet looked better than a low-fat diet. But the Atkins arm, which really even the study leaders themselves don't talk about much, the people in the Atkins arm of the study did the best, lost the most weight. Their markers for heart disease looked the best. And we don't hear about this in the press very much, and scientists don't talk about it because there is this phenomenon of that this kind of outcome is so uncomfortable for our nutrition establishment that they really, even the study leaders themselves, will not talk about their own findings in the way that I'm describing them, because there's so much stigma associated with the Atkins diet, and there's so much, presumably, awkwardness about having to reverse 50 years of dietary advice.
Yeah, it's almost like they don't know how to deal with it, because despite the fact that it did show that the Atkins diet, this is the Irish Shy one, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and they just don't know how to kind of deal with it, and how does that reflect onto the dietary guidelines that are almost sort of across the Western world, basically, that we should be having a low-fat, high carb diet, which just seems crazy. So why do you think there is this cognitive dissonance sort of through the nutrition science world?
Well, this is a really interesting subject, and a lot of the meat of my book is about the politics of nutrition science. It is deeply political because the small group of nutrition experts who are on the winning side of they're the ones who are in control of our nutrition guidelines. They control all the expert panels. They're invited to the conferences. They lead the professional societies. They dispense the grants. They also run the studies that get the grants. They they run the journals in which those studies are then published. Those are what I call the nutrition aristocrats. They're in control of our nutritional agenda. In the United States, it's the American Heart Association and the National Institute of Health. I know there's something comparable in the UK because, just as a little side note, basically the U.S. came up with this diet, and we've since exported it all over the world, the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. The people who are on the losing side, the critics, because of course there were many critics along the way. People, Pete Ahrens at Rockefeller University was incredibly well-respected lipid science, and I describe his efforts to bring to the attention his critique of this sort of haste to embrace a diet before the science really proved it to be a reliable one. And I describe what happened to him. He loses his research grants. He is pushed to the sidelines. Other critics like him are not invited on expert panels. Their voices are effectively silenced. By the mid-1980s, there was nobody prominent speaking out against the idea that fat and saturated fat causes heart disease, because by that point, scientists had learned to self-censor because they could see what happened to the generation ahead of them. That's why, as I say, the people who started doing this new round of science really did not come up through the nutritional establishment. They really had no idea what they were getting themselves into. The feeling of being ostracized, which is where they basically have to live on the margins of their scientific communities. So that's why the conversation has not been happening in a way that we expect in science, where you expect a kind of give and take of different ideas. But at some point, that because of the institutional investment in our nutritional guidelines, that conversation really just shut down.
And that's really been sort of showing over here and in Australia recently, with the BMJ retraction
Right.
of a certain article and changes as well, and one on saturated fat as well, which has kind of been changed by Dr. Aseem Malhotra, who sort of said saturated fat is not the major issue. And he's a cardiologist just down the road in South London, and also in Australia with the ABC Catalyst programs being pulled as well because they speak out against statins and saturated fat. So yeah.
Well, so what happened in Australia has to do with the fact that there is a component of industrial interest in all of our nutrition recommendations. There's the big food companies who are interested in promoting carbohydrate-based foods. So going back to the early part of the 20th century, there are cereal companies and Kellogg companies. They came up with the idea of a balanced diet in order to get people to eat more grains, and they were certainly behind the nutritional guidelines, which increased both our consumption of carbohydrate-based foods, which is a large part of what food companies make, and also vegetable oils, which was, when you move away from saturated fat, the alternative is vegetable oils. But then there's this other component of the statins, which are the biggest selling drug worldwide. What do statins do? Statins lower LDL. And all of our nutritional recommendations are aimed at lowering our LDL cholesterol. So the statin companies also had a vested interest in these nutritional guidelines, in promoting them. In the United States, all of our expert panels are full of people with a list of 8 or 9 pharmaceutical companies. These are nutrition scientists with 8 or 9 pharmaceutical companies listed on their conflict of interest statements. I mean, it's just kind of an open secret that those companies are deeply involved in our nutritional recommendations, all with the aim of keeping in place any advice aimed at lowering LDL cholesterol. So that means, it's a complicated story because it turns out that what predicts heart disease more effectively is not LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is a better predictor. Subfractions of LDL, they're called small dense LDL versus large buoyant LDL, something called lipoprotein A, which counts the LDL particles. All of those are more effective, better reliable predictors of heart disease risk. Those look better on a high-fat Atkins-style diet. But that runs contrary to what the pharmaceutical companies they don't know how to treat LDL. They can't come up with a drug that increases they don't know how to increase HDL. They don't have a drug that increases HDL without having horrible side effects. So because they know how to lower LDL, that's also had an influence on our nutritional recommendations.
As well.
I hope that's not too complicated.
Nah, it's all good. It's all good. And there is quite a good way of increasing your HDL. And how do you do that? Through food?
There's only one food that increases HDL, and that is saturated fat.
Yeah.
That's it. There's no other food.
Exactly. And it's incredible, isn't it? You sort of mentioned this in the book that it's something that just isn't mentioned.
It isn't mentioned.
Yeah, when we know HDL is like a so-called good cholesterol, we want to sort of be lifting up our HDL. They say this, but they just don't mention that, oh, by the way, if you do have more saturated fat, it will lift up your HDL.
No, they tell you to drink red wine instead. Right. Well, and actually, on a low-fat diet, your HDL drops. And it drops more precipitously for women than it does for men. So the low-fat diet actually seems to increase heart disease risk for women, as measured by HDL. But the whole conversation is focused on LDL instead, again, because that's what pharmaceutical companies know how to lower.
Yeah, absolutely. So they sort of keep on focusing on that. It's almost like Coca-Cola, just keep on focusing on, but we're making all these parks and we're getting all these kids exercising and things like that. Ignore all the research about fizzy drinks sort of creating an obesity epidemic. Sort of ignore that. Just keep on exercising and you'll be fine.
Right, that's right. I mean, our government recommends that for weight loss that you need to do 60 to 90 minutes of intense aerobics a day, physical exercise. And, I love exercise, but I don't have time for 60 to 90 minutes a day, and I think many people don't. And I think that that's a kind of a tacit acknowledgement of the failure of a diet if it only works on 60 to 90 minutes of exercise a day. For working parents, you need something that works within your life. And, I know from having worked really hard and sat in front of a desk for the last year that I can be a slug and not get fat. And that's a good fallback to know that, this diet works even without that level of exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we mentioned to our members in the exercise classes and on the YouTube channel, blogs and things like that, is that, you can exercise till the cows come home, but you're not going to lose weight until you approach your diet.
Right.
And even then, unless you're doing certain things, primarily a low-carb, high-fat diet, at least to start with, then you're not really going to see much movement at all. So yeah, we pretty much start off with like an Atkins-style diet for a foundation, and then sort of slowly but surely allow people to sort of reintroduce stuff and try and do it like over 2 to 4 weeks just to see if they can actually handle it. Because sort of, as you know, everyone's slightly different. But the baseline is, low carb, high fat, and then sort of just making sure everybody's getting real food. And that's kind of the main message here, right?
Right. And and my takeaway from the last decade of clinical trial research is, if a high-fat diet is so clearly better for health than a low-fat diet, how do you get to a high-fat diet? Unless you're drinking bowlfuls of olive oil like Italian peasants, or eating massive handfuls of nuts all day long and avocados, animal foods whole animal foods must be part of that diet. That's the only way to get to a high-fat diet. It doesn't have to be meat, which happens to be incredibly nutrient-dense food, but it doesn't have to be meat for people who don't feel comfortable with that. It can be cheese, eggs, whole-fat dairy, not low-fat. But it's almost impossible to eat a high-fat diet without eating some animal foods. We've been living on chicken and fish for so long. Chicken and fish, those are the only acceptable proteins. Yeah. Chicken is much more nutrient-poor than red meat is so much more nutrient-dense than chicken. And fish, we've fished our oceans. Plus, we have to rely on farmed fish, which has its own issues. So, we need more options.
Absolutely.
Humans need a more diverse diet, and of course, there's 4,000-year written pedigree of eating this diet. So, so that really
QED,
is the message.
Right? QED. I mean, sold
I'm
that
speaking
one.
to the converted, I know.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's you've kind of framed what's happened over the past 60 years, really, very, very well. And it's a real story that you've constructed out of this history. Highly recommend everyone to go check it out. But before we let you go, we do have a few questions on Facebook that we'll try and deal with as concisely as possible. What will it take for rank and file doctors and RDs to change their advice? That's from Larry Diamond in Texas.
Well, the problem really starts with in our country, with the government-issued guidelines. Doctors really just follow what they're told in medical school, and they're told what the USDA, their government-recommended guidelines. And I think that really we need to, in our country and in yours, have a reevaluation of the guidelines to see if the science really supports them. And that has to be the starting point for change. I mean, there's a huge burgeoning low-carbohydrate paleo movement in the U.S., and you can find doctors who follow that. But I don't think there will be widespread change until our government itself really re-examines these guidelines.
Is really on board, and kind of part of that I see happening is I know a friend of yours, Gary Taubes, who's set up a foundation called Nutrition Science Initiative that's trying to sort of sort out these problems and kind of spell it out black and white, right? So fingers crossed, we'll see.
So he's doing really important work, and one of the reasons that he had to set up this foundation is that National Institutes of Health in our country would not fund any research, still does not fund any research of a high-fat diet because they consider it too unhealthy even to study.
It's crazy. Like even with the Irish Shy study, Eric Westman's studies, Chris Gardner's study, like all of these guys, like sort of showing that the Atkins style diets sort of have better health outcomes, and still it's dangerous. Right,
too dangerous even to study. They won't even put diabetic, high-risk heart disease patients on that diet.
That's crazy. It's crazy, isn't it? Anyway, and plus with the Women's Health Initiative not showing any benefit at all.
Right.
Everything.
Right.
But so lovely, isn't it? Very difficult.
It really is maddening. And also the media is not really covering the issue, I think, in the way, I'm delighted for your interest, but I have to say that the media has been very unresponsive to,
hopefully, I mean, I'll forward this on to all the journalists I know and see if we can get you some airtime.
So my book is being published in the UK in August by Scribe.
In August, cool,
yes,
perfect. So yeah, people will be able to grab it then. Just one more question before we have to let you go. Which one we'll go for? Yeah, so Andrew Dobson from Bradford, which is up north here in the UK, says, "Hi Nina, loved your book. With regards to the use of vegetable oils in restaurants for frying food, don't fancy having shellac like gunk lining my arteries, and obviously we've all been subjected to eating the stuff since sat fat was demonized. You know, whether reverting to eating good fats can rid the body of these damaging fats."
You know, the short answer is I don't know whether or not. I mean, I think that the whole issue of heated polyunsaturated oils in restaurant fryers where they degrade into oxidation products, especially when heated at high temperatures over long periods of time, which are precisely the conditions that you have in restaurant fryers, I would say it's worth avoiding those kinds of foods and staying home and cooking your French fries in lard and tallow. You know, McDonald's used to fry their French fries in tallow. And, you know, whether the effects are lasting or, I mean, the research is still preliminary. My argument was we just need to consider when we're getting rid of trans fats, you know, we need to just consider what the alternatives are. We haven't done that. Scientists and experts and officials haven't reckoned with this whole scientific literature on these oxidation products, and I'm just saying we just need to reckon with that as a first step.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, and it's a really good part of the book that you go into detail about sort of the introduction of vegetable oils and sort of how we sort of eventually came to believe that trans fats are actually bad after a fair old while of their use in fast food restaurants and things like that. And that really, we should be reverting back to what we were cooking in sort of in the 40s and possibly the early 50s, which is, as you say, beef tallow, because that's just getting wasted at the moment.
You know,
not getting used.
The main cooking fat through all of human history has been lard, and then butter and tallow. Those are the main cooking fats. Those are solid fats. They are stable at high temperatures. They don't oxidize. Those are the best cooking fats. And then you can use olive oil on your salads.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big believer in chucking on some olive oil on my salad, but definitely just cooking in butter, lard, tallow, and maybe a little bit of coconut oil as well.
Right, exactly. delicious.
Yeah, sweet. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Nina. It's been great talking to you, and people can check out the book on your website, which is thebigfatsurprise.com, and also people can buy the book here in the UK at smashthefat.com/big fat surprise, and then obviously you just search it on Amazon.com if you're listening in the States. They can follow you on Twitter at Big Fat Surprise, and also check out the Facebook page, The Big Fat Surprise, as well. Did I miss anything out?
No, that's excellent. Thank you so much. It's just been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. I really appreciate that. And also, I almost forgot, is that you can actually download the audio book as well, which was my preference of actually learning via audible.co.uk, and if you go to smashthefat.com/audible, you can get a 30-day free trial via there, so make sure you check that out if you like to listen to audiobooks rather than read. So yeah, that's always an option. So yeah, thanks again, Nina. It's been a pleasure. Did you want to leave us with any wise words from your 10 years of research into the problem?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure talking to you, and I would just say eat fat and be well.
Perfect. That's awesome. That's awesome. Because my sign-off is usually be well and smash it out. That's
all right, we're in sync.
Absolutely, on the same level. That's great, Nina. Fantastic. Well, thanks again, and to everyone listening, make sure that you check over the Big Fat Surprise on thebigfatsurprise.com and check it out. It's a great read or listen if you're going to go to Audible. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.